Welcome to another video for Spaniard performance, and today we're going to be talking about the principles of periodization. This is a new format that I'm going to be using, so you might be listening to this on a podcast, so you're still going to be able to listen to this perfectly. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's going to be a visual guide, and this is the way that I take notes. This is the way that I brainstorm. This is the best way for me to understand things and put things into perspective, and also to teach them. So I love the whiteboard, but I think this is going to be a little bit better, and it's going to be a little bit more practical, especially for coaches or people that are studying exercise science, or even athletes that just want to know a little bit better about how strength coaches program, how strength coaches create results. So let's get into it. We're talking about principles of periodization, and we're going to be talking about different. I think a bigger flaw that I think I've seen when we talk about periodizing for an athlete, when we're talking about planning somebody's training, and what I think is a better way of approaching it. So I do think that a lot of coaches just do this in a natural way. I just haven't seen it explained many times. I think Cal Dietz has covered this a few times when he's talking about how he evaluates training every so often, and I think that's key. I think one of the biggest problems is the one that we're going to be talking about is looking at things too long term from too far away, just because we don't know what adaptations we're obtaining and if the training that we're doing works. So using the general adaptive syndrome, which is pretty much what describes the whole process of training, where we start training, we are going to get some negative results on performance, which is going to be just fatigue induced. And once we are adapting, so there's a super compensation process where the athlete is going to adapt to whatever training or stimulus we're giving them. And they're going to go back to a better state of performance that they were before, and maybe just plateau at that point whenever that training is not getting any more results. So when we think about this, I think the biggest problem, the biggest flaw is that these periodizing systems usually are based on a long-term vision. So a lot of the times coaches and performance directors are going to ask their performance coaches to look at this from a whole year perspective. So if we're looking at any team, professional, college, individual athletes, they want to look at the whole year, and they want to look at what are they going to be doing, what is going to be the emphasis that we're going to be having throughout the year. I think this can be possible in a way, but we cannot, if we're looking at it from a performance standpoint, we cannot do this for any athlete just because we're completely guessing what is the GAP process, how long this process is going to take, and we have absolutely no idea not only how the whole process is going to take, but how long each one of these phases is going to last. We have no clue whatsoever because we don't know each one of the athletes. And even if we know an athlete, depending on the stage that that they find themselves, it's also going to be different. Even though we've run this before, we've used the same training methods, and we've used it with athletes that are similar, this is going to change from one athlete to another. So I think that's why this can become a problem. I understand if we have a season and we need to think about games, we need to think about different tournaments, this is going to be key. Like, where do we want more fatigue or less fatigue? That's going to happen, especially when we're in season. But if we're thinking about improving performance, the methods that we should follow should just depend on what is the progress of the athlete. Now, we can modify fatigue and we can modify those intensities depending on what part of the season we find ourselves. But the overall goal of that athlete to improve in a certain way when it comes to performance should always be the same. It should be by the results, and it should be changing short term. So that's the key for me. I think periodizing should go by in a short term basis, and depending on what results we have from them. So in kind of like a three step process that I follow, I think the first thing is going to be to classify those athletes, to find the baseline, to have some testing done, to just have conversation with those athletes. Because at the end of the day, some places are going to have more resources when it comes to obtaining KPIs, when it comes to getting some data that's going to allow that strength coach to create those programs, to understand the readiness of the athlete, to work on the imbalances, whatever we want to talk about, there is data for all of that. Some places are going to have it, some coaches are not going to have it. So the athlete classification and the baseline can be a process of getting data from those objective measures that we're talking about with the sports science and getting data from the athlete itself. We can have conversation with that athlete, and one of the things that I've is being game changer for me is using just a page like this that I like to write on for each athlete, and I write things for that athlete. I know the injuries, I know how they've been training, I know what they like, I know what they don't like, I know if they trained with their dad in their garage when they were little. Any information is going to be useful for you to program for that athlete. When it comes to groups, it's going to become harder. Like if you're in college, if you're a professional setting and you have a lot of athletes at the same time, I do think it's going to be harder to do this, but you're going to be able to somehow classify that big group into smaller buckets. You're going to find patterns in those athletes, either on the data or on the way they've lived their life, on the way they've trained on the past. You can generalize for the smaller individuals, creating different buckets and having different groups. And that's just going to be the best solution for you to understand these short-term process of periodizing for those athletes. Instead of having one athlete at a time, you're going to have a smaller groups of athletes inside that bigger group in order to be able to program. So the second step, I think, is understanding those KPIs and training. This might be a first step before that first step that we just talked about, because I think this is the key: understanding what your KPIs are and understanding what those means and what those KPIs, if we're talking about data science or you're talking about sports science, what those KPIs are telling you, because the different people is going to say different things. You're going to have to develop your own way of thinking about those KPIs, especially when we're talking about sports science. There's going to be so many ways to do this. Just find your own way. We're not going to be talking about this at all because we could go for hours, and I could be wrong in uh, so many of the conclusions that I get to, just because that's been my experience, and some other coaches might find different experiences. So that's the first thing: find those KPIs, find whatever those data points are telling you, and then find the training that's appropriate to get those athletes from point A to point B, from whatever state that we found of that GAP at the beginning to whatever better state of performance is going to be. And once they get to a plateau, what is the training method that we're going to use to get out of that plateau and to keep improving with that athlete? That's the key for me. Find those two: the KPIs and the training methods that you use to address those KPIs and to address that state of that athlete. And then lastly, the way of periodizing, right? The short term way that we were talking about, reevaluate. I think daily testing every time you have a chance to do that with that athlete. I used to have athletes 5 times a week, and we used to test 3 times a week. That worked very good just because I have a lot of data points, and I think it's easier to see trends the more data points you have. But test them as often as you can. Also, another a lot of times there's gonna be no way of testing. There's gonna be coaches all over the place that are not gonna have any objective way of testing for the sports science that we're talking about. So that's your page right there. Every week you can have small conversations with those athletes and take a few notes for that athlete if there's no data available. I will do both if I could, but it also depends on your time constraints. It depends on the ability to do this. It depends how many people you have under you. There's going to be so many variables here, but just do something in order to get some information as often as you can to kind of find some patterns. And then the key part at the end is, how often do you think you're going to find those patterns? I will never be able to tell you when. And like we said before, there is no way that we can guess how long is this GAP process going to take? How long are they going to take to the overtraining portion of it, when the fatigue is kicking in, to the super compensation portion, to the plateau? We don't know when that athlete is going to get to either one of those states. So keep testing and keep checking for patterns. The more often you do it, the better you're going to be able to see these changes. And if you're with groups, it's going to have to be group changes. You're not always going to be able to do this individually, but you're going to be able to see this in a better way and a short-term way, and understanding what is this training method that I'm using causing in this athlete, And that is something that you can also write down. So the more often you can do this, the better information you're going to have and the better decisions you're going to be able to make. So once again, I appreciate you watching this video. I appreciate any comments, any criticism, positive and negative, whatever you want to do, discussions that we can have on the comments, privately on Instagram, on messages, on emails. I've always appreciated it. And if you like this video, I appreciate you sharing it. So I'll see you in the next video.